Good morning, everyone. My name is Neera Tandon, and I'm president of the Center for American Progress. And I'm really happy and honored to have you all here as part of this event that we're doing with our partners at the Education Trust. We're here to discuss the remarkable work that's taking place right now in Chicago's public schools. Over the last few decades, the city's educators have faced significant challenges, from falling enrollment amongst the students to continual threats of cuts in their budget. And yet, despite all of these challenges, the leaders and allies of Chicago's school system have taken decisive action to spark dramatic gains among its students. A recent study from Stanford University found that Chicago students have seen dramatically higher improvements in their test scores when compared to 96% of all other school districts in the country. What's more, between 2006 and 2017, Chicago students scored higher on their AP tests, raised their average result on the ACT, and saw their high school graduation rate increase by nearly 20 percentage points. All across Chicago, schools are using data to make smarter decisions and to increase public oversight, while also empowering their principals and teachers to drive change at the grassroots level. We can look at the example of Edward Everett Elementary School in McKinley Park. It's just really one of the examples of the tremendous leadership of our guests. Principal Rodolfo Roja is here. Hi, Principal. Everett Elementary School serves a student body where 95% of children are from low-income households, and roughly half are English language learners. When Rodolfo took the helm at Everett about 6 years ago, the school was struggling to fulfill its responsibilities. But thankfully, with the help of Everett's teachers and outside partners like Chicago Public Education Fund, Mr. Roja has helped Everett secure the second highest level gain out by Chicago Public School System. That is a remarkable achievement. So we're here to celebrate the great success of what's happening at Everett Elementary School and in classrooms throughout Chicago, but we really want to understand why it's been so successful and spread their success to communities across the United States. That's why CAP and the Education Trust are so proud to host this event together. I want to thank Congressman Danny Davis, who will close today's program, and all of our incredible panelists who are helping to lead Chicago's remarkable change. It's a change transforming schools, communities, families, and most importantly, Chicago writ large. And now I have the great pleasure of introducing two of our guests today to the stage. Dr. Janice Jackson is a native of the Windy Cities who's served at nearly every level of its education system, including time spent as a social studies teacher, a champion debate coach, a high school principal, and now as the CEO of Chicago's public schools. We also have Beth Swanson, who has worked in several leadership roles in Chicago's public schools under the former CEO, Arnie Duncan, and current Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and she now acts as Vice President of Strategy and Programs with the Joyce Foundation. These are really two inspiring women who have transformed the schools and who are doing so much to ensure that kids are learning what they need to learn. So we're grateful to both of them, and let me please welcome them both to the stage.
Thank you, Neera. And thanks again for all of you for being here today. As Neera mentioned, I'm Beth Swanson, Vice President of the Joyce Foundation, and Joyce works on policy issues throughout the Great Lakes region and also nationally, and we've had a long history working on education reform and longtime partners with both CAP and the Education Trust, so thank you so much for having us. I'm going to let Janice do a little bit more introduction of herself here, but I want to jump in. We're obviously here to celebrate and understand the success story of Chicago Public Schools and the tremendous amount of research that's been put out over the last many months. It's extremely exciting. But Janice really has, as Neera mentioned, sort of seen this progress and lived it through various roles, teacher, principal, administrator, maybe most importantly, parent. Yeah, and now CEO. And so I'd just love for you to talk a little bit about that journey and sort of the progress that you've seen on the ground in the time you've been engaged.
Yeah. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'll try to be brief because I can talk a lot and talk about myself even longer. But I think what's important to know is that I am a lifelong Chicagoan, and I often tell folks it's something that I'm really proud of is that all of my education has been in Chicago public schools and public institutions in the state of Illinois. And because of my experience there and everything that I gained as a result, I am a huge proponent of public education, and it's really what drives me. Again, I started out in Head Start, participating in many of the programs that we all know matter and really change outcomes, especially for students who come from low income and disadvantaged backgrounds. So me and my 4 siblings grew up on the south side of Chicago, all attending Chicago public schools. And really, in every single stage, I paid close attention to the reform efforts of what was happening in the district. I remember when then Secretary of Education Bill Bennett said that Chicago Public Schools was one of the worst in the country. I was in about 10th grade. I mean, not 10th grade, I was about 10 in 5th grade, and remember just a lot of the changes that happened as a result. Fast forward, it's an honor to be in this role. I think that I do have a unique perspective because I have every stake possible in CPS and Chicago being a successful school system and district, and it's just an honor to be able to serve in this role today. The last thing I'll say is that what really drives me is really bridging the opportunity gap. We talk a lot about the achievement gap, but I really think that I have been able to sit in places like this because, you know, there was always an educator or someone who saw something in me that I didn't see in myself and provided an opportunity and a pathway for me to be successful. So all of the work that I do is really about bridging the opportunity gap for youth in Chicago.
Terrific. You know, the NAEP data was incredible, as Nira mentioned, but also this has been the last decade.
Yeah.
You know, graduation rates at all-time highs, now at 74%, 17 points last decade. Freshmen on track, even higher. And can you tell us a little bit, what are the headlines of the research?
Yeah.
Walk us through it a little bit. And then also just behind the headlines, you know, what does it look like to you on the ground? What is the most exciting parts of this?
I mean, I think as an educator and a practitioner, seeing things that you have control over, like freshmen on track and graduation rates rise and test scores all pointing in the right direction, is really affirming because people go to schools every day working extremely hard, and unfortunately, sometimes we spend time working on things that don't get us the outcomes that we expect. But in Chicago, it's been a unique story in that all of the arrows are pointing in the right direction. So you talked about the improved graduation rates, improved on-track rates, but we've been able to do that, but also see better performance on standardized assessments. And when we compare ourselves both locally and also nationally, we see some pretty impressive gains. It was mentioned in the introduction, the Reardon study, which said that CPS students perform better than 96% of the public school systems in the country. And I think that's important to note. They didn't say 96% of large public school systems or low-income public. This is all public school systems throughout the country. And it was really encouraging to see that in 3rd grade, Chicago public school students start out like many students in other large districts like Baltimore and some of the others, but after 5 years, 3rd through 8th grade, they actually get 6 years of learning. And so if we can continue that pace and even accelerate that pace, I know that we're going to catch up with the goals that we've set as a district. I think the thing that's been most encouraging to me is that we've been able to do this while increasing access. So we were recognized as AP District of the Year for the 2nd time in the past, I believe, 7 years. And we were able to do that not just because our students, more and more students are passing AP exams, but more and more students are actually enrolled in advanced placement courses. And so this narrative is around access and equity, and we still have a lot of work to do, but things are pointing in the right direction, and I think educators are feeling really motivated around that. So, this was a really great time for me to come in as CEO.
Yeah, and on that access and equity point, I mean, you have the largest IB program in the nation.
Yeah, we're very proud of that.
Dual enrollment, dual credit, expanding as we speak.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you are really firing on all cylinders here to get the rigor up.
Yeah, I think we've taken an approach. I mean, it's a multi-pronged approach. So we look at policy, which is, obviously within the district's control. You talked a little bit about dual credit and dual enrollment. We set a goal for 50% of our seniors to graduate with some type of early college credential in their back pocket. So that's either passing an AP exam, passing IB, or having access to early college through our city colleges and also some of our 4-year universities. And right now we're at about 43%, which is really encouraging. And I think we're in striking distance of hitting our goal of 50%. And what that means for students, again, it's not just about obtaining a credential or a credit. It's a few things. It makes college more affordable. Our families have really taken advantage of that and appreciate that. But it also gives our students the confidence that college is a place that they can be successful. And for many of our students, they may go off to college and they're prepared academically, but typically the finances and also just fitting in and feeling like this is a place that I belong is a big hurdle. So that confidence piece cannot be stressed enough.
Yeah. I know the equity piece is still also a challenge for the district.
Yeah.
So tremendous part of the research has showed that all subgroups are gaining, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's on the rise. However, there's still a lag with the African American students, and they're not accelerating at the same rate. Could you talk a little bit about that and sort of how you view that issue and what the district might be doing to address it?
Yeah, well, one thing I'll say is that I won't be satisfied until we can narrow the achievement gap. And if I'm able to close it, I've already identified the place where I want my statue in Chicago. So that's what we're working towards. That's what it's all about. But no, seriously, what we've learned from the reforms and efforts that we've put in place in the district is that they work for all students, and that's encouraging. So we see it working for low-income students, high-income students, students from disadvantaged backgrounds and the like. But the achievement gap still exists, and that's an issue for us. So what we've tried to do is to be more strategic in the things that we put in place, prioritizing the areas that need additional support. And my message to the leaders in Chicago is obviously we're going to take a victory lap on the successes, but then we're going to double down and make sure that all students are benefiting, and that we cannot be satisfied when, every time we look at a data set, we see these disparities. But what does give me hope, in University of Illinois at Chicago published a study called Upstate, Downstate, and I would encourage folks to take a look at it. But essentially what came out of that report is that when you do an apples to apples comparison of students in Chicago public schools compared to their peers with the same demographic makeup throughout the state, in every single group, Chicago outperforms their peers. So low income white students in Chicago outperform low income white students throughout the state. High income white students in Chicago outperform high income white students throughout the state. You go through each group, and we've never seen anything like that. So again, all tides are rising, but we know the starting point, we started with those gaps. One thing that we have done, just cycling back to the conversation around advanced placement, is partnering with people like Equal Opportunity Schools to help schools use data to identify students who may not be the students that we think are going to take advantage of AP classes and IB classes, but really providing them data and profiles of students so that we start to encourage kids to take on these courses and more rigorous course loads. And not just, basing it on teacher recommendations or the kids who are going to be okay, no matter who's in front of them.
And I've had the privilege, and so the other panelists, of hearing Janice speak before, and sort of, I'll try to put into a few of the buckets that I know you believe is driving the success. And one is around, obviously, rigorous instruction and high-quality programming, and obviously it's driven by high-quality teachers within classrooms every day.
Absolutely.
Then there's principal leadership, and principals are key, and we have a principal we'll hear from soon. And then also data and transparency. And that's the third big piece around strategic data partnerships as well, which we'll hear more about from the panel. But if you could give us your just top lines on what those three have meant to you and how they feed into the progress.
I'll start with data because I think it all comes back to that. So if you look, first of all, we have an amazing partnership with the University of Chicago and the consortium and UEI, and you will hear more about that today. But what's encouraging for us is that we are trying out things in our school system, but it's grounded in research and evidence and data from the University of Chicago. But we also have this partnership where they have access to all of our student data, and in addition to them providing us with findings and things that prompt our thinking and changes practice at the district level, there's also this trusting relationship that allows us to give them access and for them to be completely honest with us. But there have been some really powerful things that came out as a result of that. One would be Freshmen on Track. I remember being a principal and hearing about this metric and thinking like, wow, you know, students are more likely to graduate, 3 times more likely to graduate if they're on track after 9th grade. And not just in my school, throughout the city, schools began to organize themselves around looking at student data and providing support for students. And it really has changed practice. And the other part of that is that the Freshmen on Track rate was directly correlated with the graduation rate. So as we work to improve Freshmen on Track outcomes, we saw a direct correlation to students graduating. So that's one example. Another example I'll give, and it taps into the rigorous instruction and programming, is the University of Chicago did a study that really showed that students who participated in international baccalaureate programs outperform their peers who did not participate in those programs, and in some cases did better than students that participated in our more selective schools. So it really helped change this narrative in Chicago. We have more than 5 good high schools, and as a result, we've really expanded those programs. And then finally, because Heather will kill me if I don't talk about this, but it's honestly the truth, the principals have been a key lever of change in Chicago. And I think leadership matters. If you look at leadership from the top, there's been a lot of change at the CEO level, which I will stop, and I keep telling everybody, you will not see that turnover. I'm here to stay. But we would not be able to see the growth that Chicago has been enjoying without consistent leadership at the school level. And our partnership with the fund has allowed us to pay attention to not just principal selection and placement, but principal support while they're in their role, and more importantly, retention and succession planning. So I'm really excited, and you'll hear more about that work when the other panelists come up.
Great, and that might be a good transition point, actually. We have a quick stage change, and so we'll bring up our other panelists as that's happening. I think we just have to stand up
And let them do
let the chairs arrive. And as this is getting settled, we're going to invite Sarah Ray Stalinga, Director of the University of Chicago Urban Education Institute. She's going to help us dig into that data, the data partnerships, we good? And that unique relationship, I really think, between UEI and the consortium. We also have Heather Anachini, who leads the CEO of the Public Education Fund in Chicago and leads the work on principals for the city. And Rodolfo Rojas, principal of Everett Elementary School. And he'll help us get a perspective on really how all of this, the data and the principal sports, really plays out in practice every day. So if everyone could join me, that would be great. Thank you. It's fun. I feel like we've taken the show on the road. It's very exciting. It's like we usually just see each other passing in meetings and hallways. So this is exciting to be here in DC. So thank you for having us. Sarah, I want to start with you, and obviously data is really why we're here and talking about this progress. But if you could tell us a little bit more about the Urban Education Initiative, and specifically Chicago Consortium on Chicago School Research, because it is a very unique partnership and one that's really been trying to be replicated nationwide. So if you could give us insight on that, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to contextualize talking about the consortium by just saying a few sentences about the Urban Education Institute, where the consortium lives. So the Urban Education Institute has 4 units within it. We actually run a public school. We have a charter school, UChicago Charter, a pre-K through 12th grade school that serves 1,800 students on the south side of Chicago. We also run the University of Chicago's teacher education program, the Urban Teacher Education Program there. So we give master's degrees and certified teachers for Chicago, specifically focused on teachers for Chicago. And then we have a tools division called UChicago Impact, which disseminates some of the research tools that we'll be talking about here nationally across the United States. And then, of course, we have the UChicago Consortium, which in some ways is the grandmother of UEI. It's been in existence for 28 years, so just about for 3 decades. It was created when the 1988 Chicago School Reform Act was passed. Really to study what was then this pretty radical experiment in decentralization. And the consortium, I think, is unique in its relationship with the school district, and I think this is a really important part of the work. which is it's research that's conducted with the rigor of what you would see at a place like University of Chicago, but it's done in an iterative way in tight partnership with Chicago Public Schools. And that trusting relationship is relational research, and that's very, very important. So I think there's a couple of critical components to that that make the consortium and the consortium model unique in research. One of those is a strict no surprises rule that we have with the school district and with the mayor's office
We
as well.
appreciate that.
And actually, just to put the consortium's history in perspective, there have been 12 superintendents / CEOs in Chicago since the consortium began. So that no surprises rule is really important because we want to position ourselves in a way that the school district and the mayor's office is very aware of what the findings of our studies will be prior to them being released publicly. So there's no gotcha moment. But it's also iterative in the sense that what we're doing is going back and forth on studies as they're in process. So it isn't just we come to Janice and her team at the end and say, here are the findings. It's we're talking with them when we launch a study, as it's going on, sort of going back and forth and having the school district weigh in on interpretations and really understanding where things are going. I think the last thing I would say about the consortium is its neutrality, which I think is very important, and that might be, it's unpopular in the DC setting, but we're really policy neutral, and I think that's been very important for our work as well, meaning we don't make direct policy recommendations from our work. What we're doing is trying to kind of hold up a mirror to the school district and say, here is what your data say, and helping them to use that in a way that's actionable, but not giving direct recommendations either on district policy or on state or national policy, but rather working with the district to help them find the solutions to the challenges that are raised. The last thing I would say is that the consortium's model is now being emulated across the country. And so there are now, I understand, 20 other consortia in other places across the country that are doing the type of place-based research in partnership with school districts across the country. And so we're encouraged that others are moving in this direction.
Great. And I know you describe it as holding up a mirror, but also could you give us an idea of just sort of how that translates to practice? I mean, I know you see some research and data really changing school behavior, whether it's principal, teachers, et cetera, but maybe an example of how it plays out on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Janice talked about Freshmen on Track, and that would definitely be one of the examples that I would point to as a discovery that the consortium made, this idea that course credits and grades in the freshman year, so accumulating the right number of credits to be on track. And the first time that that discovery was made, there was a lot of disbelief that it was real, and not just on the part of Chicago Public Schools, but nationally. And there was sort of resistance to this idea. I think it went against strongly held beliefs about what matters for high school graduation. There were assumptions that it was test scores. There were assumptions that for some students, high school was already too late, frankly. And I think this pushed up against some of these deep assumptions that were held in the field about what matters. And the consortium really is about identifying what matters and then helping to support the school district in partnership with other organizations like the Chicago Public Education Fund and the nonprofit and philanthropic community to make this happen. So the way that happened on the ground is the importance of the indicator being discovered, and really then Chicago Public Schools picking up the idea of building the data infrastructure and a real-time data reporting system in which high schools started to receive Freshmen on Track lists every 6 weeks that essentially literally is almost like just a spreadsheet. Here are your students that are off track, here are the ones that are at risk of going off track, and then leaving it to the schools in a really appropriate way to figure out what are the right interventions in order to be able to intervene and support students. So I see in some ways, Beth, that it's a partnership and a handoff back and forth, where we see this work as being very collaborative and going back and forth between the research and practice line in sort of a very fluid way.
Yeah, thanks. And that also, principals are armed now with that data, those tools to really make on-the-ground decisions.
Absolutely.
And drive instruction. Heather, I'd love to bring you into the conversation and talk a little bit more about the Chicago Public Education Fund, and also why you focused solely on principals.
Sure. So the fund is a little bit of a
a unique organization. We're an independent nonprofit that partners with Chicago Public Schools and the charter community across the city of Chicago. Our motto is that we're transforming schools by investing in the talented educators who lead them. And for the last 20 years, we've been really focused on the idea that change happens in schools and that educators drive that kind of change. So where Sarah and her team at the consortium are coming out with really important research like Freshmen on Track, we think about the fact that it is principals and teacher teams in schools that have to innovate around that data. You know, Janice, you and I have talked about what your team and teams did with that data when you were leading a school, and it looks different in each of the 125 high schools across the city of Chicago. Our theory of action at the fund has consistently been that you can't try to make it look the same. You have to empower those individual principals and their educator teams to make the kinds of decisions they need to make on the ground. And then you have to hold them accountable through those dashboards and that data that Sarah was mentioning in a way that's really meaningful. So we see ourselves sort of in between that really important research and the work that Chicago Public Schools does as a partner with principals and their teacher teams in making those kinds of decisions. And why do we focus on principals and not teachers? You know, there are a couple of reasons. We raise about $20 to $30 million every 5 years. The district's budget, as everyone on this panel knows, is $5.5 billion a year. And so you've got to really think about where strategic philanthropy can go pretty far.
Yeah.
And I've heard Janice say it, but I'll repeat it. I can count 664 principals. And together we do count 664 principals and think about how we support folks like Rodolfo in the work that they're doing in schools to be innovative around the information that we have.
Could you talk a little bit about the context that the principals work in? And Rodolfo, I'd love your thoughts on this as well. But it's really unique, and I think as we have a lens on what could be replicated or what policies, practices could be brought throughout the nation, whether or not you have a Chicago Public Education Fund, I think everyone should have a public education fund, and your work is critical. But there are some real policy levers that I think are unique around autonomy, eligibility, and honestly, all panelists could talk to this, but Heather, maybe take the first crack.
I think that there are two layers of policy that have really mattered for us in Chicago. Sarah mentioned the first, which is that in 1988 and then again in 1995, the state legislature passed a series of reform legislation that really changed the way that Chicago's public schools work. So we are the most decentralized large urban public school system in the country, and maybe the largest, or the only that really has this kind of context. Our principals in the traditional district schools are selected by elected local school councils. So each individual school has its own mini school board, and charter schools have their charter boards as well that are making those principal selections and signing off on the budget for the school. So it really took sort of what would be considered centralized decision making and put it back in communities in some meaningful ways, and in the process gave principals a kind of authority that is really unprecedented. Before I came back to do my work at the fund, I had done a lot of work nationally, and having grown up in the Chicago system, it was really stunning to me to go into other people's schools and hear that they were not able to make decisions about the team in their building, for example, about how they implemented curriculum, or about how they made budget decisions. In Chicago, those decisions by law live at the school level. And then the second piece I'll say is that Chicago has embraced that. You could have imagined a world in which Chicago said to the state, well, thanks a lot, and now we're going to do everything we can from a policy perspective to reel that back. And instead, Chicago as a district has said, we're going to invest in that. We're going to give our principals more control over their budgets. We're going to give our principals the ability to be more autonomous in some of the work that they're doing. And we're going to raise up the stories of people that are doing that work really well. And frankly, Janice and her entire team is an example of people that we're going to promote from within, because they have proven that they can leverage that autonomy in a really meaningful way. You mentioned eligibility, and I'll just say something briefly on that. The other thing Chicago has done is take very seriously the quality of their principals.
And so they have said, we have a higher quality bar than what the state has put out there, and no one will be able to apply with a local school council for a principal position in our city unless they've hit that quality bar. So they set that goal, they manage the pipeline programs and providers to that goal, and have helped really push from a local policy level to make sure that the principals coming in are prepared to leverage the autonomy that they have to change work in schools.
And we have one of those high-quality principals with us. So,
good morning.
Rodolfo, thank you for being here and taking time. I know it's like the hardest job, I feel like, in America is the school principal. So thank you for being here and taking time away. Just for a little context, you have held numerous roles, security guard, clerk, teacher, now principal.
Yes.
You've been a principal for 6 years, taking a school that was on level 3 probationary school, and within 6 years to a 1+ level, which in Chicago means the highest rating that you can get in our city. It's a short period of time to make that tremendous amount of change, and so we'd just love to hear more about your school and how some of this work really plays out day to day.
Yeah, it's been great working for Chicago Public Schools. I graduated, I was a student myself with the Chicago Public Schools, and now working as a principal affecting students like myself has been very, very satisfying. I have worked with the fund for 4 years now, and I feel like the investment that the district and the partners are putting in with the principals has been critical with the work that we've been doing in the schools. I know that I feel prepared to go into the classroom every day, or into the school, and be able to do all the things that I need to do because of all the preparation that I have gone through. I've gone through, for example, this past year I was part of the Principal Fellowship Program, coming to an end now, but I was also part of the fund through the 5 Essentials, working on bridging or making better relationships with my teachers. That was one of the areas of focus for me for this year, on establishing better relationships with staff and principal, and it's something that I value and I invest a lot of time in, mainly because it's the work that teachers have been putting into the classroom. I value the teachers that work in the school, and a lot of the work that I do as a principal, as professional, and the professional development part, is really to make sure that the teachers are prepared and have the tools necessary to make those changes in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. And you referenced one, a fellowship that the Chicago Public Education Fund has been supporting your work,
Yes.
but also the 5 Essentials to School Success, which has emerged from the consortium work. So terrific to hear that that's just even your framework of being, in that school and using those tools. Now I know you're 95% free and reduced lunch,
Yes.
correct, school, and almost close to 50% English language learners. So
Yes.
You are working with a challenging community and challenging group of students, but could you give us an idea of some of the supports you're using in your classroom, or if you're leveraging other partners to come in and help you do that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we've done, a couple of things. So I provide additional support in the classroom. So normally I have a teacher and an assistant in the classroom, really because I want to focus on targeting every student every day, right? So we do small groups and we do interventions in the classroom, and we want to make sure that we're hitting every student every day, right? And thanks to the way that creative budgeting has happened in the district, that has allowed me the opportunity to be able to provide my teachers with all the essential materials and the different things that they need in the classroom to be successful. And then through other outside partners, like for example, we work with the Chicago Literacy Group, who comes into the school and provides kind of like a professional development within the school. They come in every 5 weeks. We go 5 weeks and then 5 weeks off, because we alternate between literacy and math. So we do 5 weeks with the Chicago Literacy Group. And really we work with my ILT to identify areas that we're gonna be focusing on for the next 5 weeks. And then we work in conjunction with the Chicago Literacy Group to make sure that we're targeting areas that we wanna focus on for teacher development.
So Chicago Literacy Group is a great example, and of something we talk a lot about in Chicago, of sort of this ecosystem that really is helping drive this progress. So it's not just one leader, one organization, one school, that it's truly this incredible network of leadership from the civic community, the business leaders, down to the classroom level. So I don't know, Janice, maybe start with you, but all of you, please jump in on this, because I mean, you all represent different parts of that ecosystem that I think it's hard to quantify, but I feel like really helps drive the success in Chicago. So sort of what does it mean to you to have this sort of, net really like around the system?
So as a district leader, the first thing that's important is that you have to embrace it. And I was writing some notes as I was listening to Sarah speak, because oftentimes when I'm speaking to folks throughout the country, when I talk about our relationship with the consortium or UEI or the relationship with the fund, they can't believe that, number one, we've established this relationship and that there are the high levels of trust that exist, but that we share data. I mean, and it's not like we share the data after the data is collected and we look at it and we think it's okay. We have data sharing agreements where they can see student performance, principal performance data, talent data, and they are constantly looking at that and bringing it back to us, and I think it's important. But even beyond that, the higher ed community, elected officials in Chicago, everyone seems to be focused on public education, which is really nice, and I think that it allows for the support that's needed for us to get from this level to the next level. But I also think that it increases the accountability, because people actually know what's going on. They care about what's going on. So we talked a little bit about data earlier, but one thing that I want to leave with this group is that I believe in Chicago, the level of accountability is great, and I think it's a good thing. I know some people shy away from that, but we're very transparent about student performance, how the district is performing. We track almost everything, and it's posted and there for public consumption and review and debate. And for me, I like working in an environment like that, because we are being held accountable to the people that we're serving. And I think that if other districts are thinking about what is it that we can do to move to the next level, I think being transparent and sharing the information is the best thing that you can do. And as a result, people are more likely to help you and come, into this ecosystem to support us.
Or some call it
yeah,
exoskeleton.
I know, I wanted to say sorry, that's
we
an
debate
inside joke.
called.
Yeah. But the one thing that I did want to touch upon when I was listening to Rodolfo's statement, two things. One, the budget autonomy. When I heard you speak about, having 50% of your students being ELL students, and principals they receive student-based budgeting, they receive a lump sum budget where they can design their school the way that they see fit. And I think that that's really empowering. So it allows you to look at your students, assess their needs, and make sure that you organize the school around that. But I also wondered if you could talk a little bit about the policy work that you're doing in the Fellows group, because the fund supports the Fellows Project, which is a principal retention strategy. But one of the things that I added to that was we do policy work. So when the principals come in, the first couple of meetings, we give them a crash course in policy development and implementation. I tell all of them two things. One, I had a CEO who told me, don't complain about policy. You can change policy in 45 days. And I found that very empowering. And as a principal, I started doing that through these long emails and meetings. But I wanted to make that more systematic in the district. And so we have the best principals in the city participate in this annually, and they learn about policy formation and implementation, and they actually create policy solutions for the district. And the thing that I get out of that as a district leader is now I have every year 30 or 40 individuals that, number one, better understand how policy is formed and implemented, which a lot of practitioners don't. And then second, they're out there as champions and people on the front lines helping us to implement it. And so again, it's just another way that principal leadership has helped move things along in Chicago. But I don't know if you want to say real quick, I know we're on time.
No, for sure.
We're working on.
So I think for me as a principal, this was a very exciting opportunity to be able to be part of the policy group, because as a principal, I found previous to this opportunity that sometimes we complain a lot about the money that we get from the district, right? And we always have something to complain about. So, but that gave me the opportunity to realize how difficult their job is, because we get to see firsthand where, number one, how limited the money is and how far they stretch it. But things like, for example, the policy group that I'm working with is funding the special ed programs, just because we always find that it doesn't matter how we try to schedule our schools, we're always short on how we want the staff to look within the building, right? We always want to have more people within the building, but it's really an intricate part of just to see how difficult it is just to change the policy around, especially around funding for special ed, because there's not a lot of money that they have to stretch a long way, right? So I think that was the biggest learning curve when I went through this process, because I realized how, number one, how difficult it is and how many different needs schools across the district have. Even working within the folks that were in my group, we had such different needs that we found it difficult a lot of times to come to an agreement. Imagine that being replicated at district level. I mean, hats off to the folks that are doing that work, because I don't know how they do this work to make sure that everybody's receiving all the all the resources that they need, and still have people, not me anymore, but other folks complaining about these things.
That's the goal.
I wanted to add something about Janice, your first point about the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I think this has been one of our learnings at the Urban Education Institute, is this need. I mean, data is not enough on its own.
Yeah.
You need to have research, data, and professional learning coupled together before you really start to see improvement. And I think, you know, to apply that to the Freshman on Track story, Freshman on Track was around and people knew about it for a long time, and really Freshman on Track stayed stagnant for years, you know, stuck at about 50% for a long time. And it wasn't until that was turned into this every 6-week data reporting system so that the principals could actually use the data, but then bringing professional learning to bear. You know, the University of Chicago's Network for College Success has certainly been a big piece of that, that actually has a group of people that bring school leadership teams together to help them dissect their data. And the work that they do is really amazing. I mean, they are going down as a leadership team to the individual kid level and talking about interventions for individual kids in their high school. And I think unless you have that combination of this research-based understanding and data that you have in your hands in the right place at the right time in the right format, coupled with these professional learning opportunities, that we started to see really things take off. And that is an ecosystem perspective. There's no one organization, Chicago Public Schools, nobody can do this on their own. It's a collaborative effort, and I think that's the power of some of what's happened in Chicago.
I think it's also the case in the examples that we've heard that there is this sense that where the decision needs to be made is on the ground. So I think most public school districts across the country would say they don't have enough money. Chicago is no exception. Illinois underfunds in many ways its public schools. That's true. And when you pull out legacy debt and pension obligations, the dollars that actually get down to schools are pretty small. And you have two choices in situations like that. You can say, we're going to go with one model that we believe works, and everyone's going to implement that model. Which I think in some ways is what we see with the policy groups, right? The principals come together and they start to look for what's the one model we might be able to implement here. And you run up against these constraints. And in Chicago, we've made the decision every time we run up against those constraints to say, let's put the decision in the hands of the principals and teachers on the ground. We got to put some parameters around it. We need to share best practice or promising practice where we see it. We invest in organizations like the Network for College Success to help help other people see those promising practices in action. But the decision making needs to happen on the ground. And I think that's a real decision point for all public school systems, and it's a place where Chicago's made a different choice than a lot of other places.
If I could just make one additional point to that, and I think for people listening to this and wondering, like, what does that mean when you give up that much authority and things are decentralized in that way? I will give you 3 reasons why it works. Number one, Chicago is a large district like many others represented in the room, and things are very unique and nuanced at the local level. So putting it back, there, allows us to make better decisions. The second thing I will say is that the innovation happens faster at the ground level. I mean, the district, we always have great ideas, but it takes a while to get it done. So I can talk about a lot of things that are happening in CPS and point to a group or PLC of principals that have been working on this and really helped spark that idea, and we just kind of got behind it to help move it along. And then the third piece is leadership, leadership, leadership. And it's not just leadership at the top, but parent leadership through our local school councils, principal leadership, teacher leadership. all of those things converging really helps things move along a lot faster than just things coming out, you know, with this top-down approach. So it's hard if you're not in that context to really understand what it looks like day to day. But if you go into Chicago, I think that it's so ingrained that people feel this level of autonomy. But the one caution that I will give you is that you can't have that level of autonomy without accountability. And so we have both of those systems in place. We value autonomy. It's extremely important. It's a core value. But again, the accountability systems are in place. And I think that provides the balance that's necessary so that it's not, you know, change gone wild. Yeah.
And I think that model of school improvement is supported in what we know works nationally. You can't transport models from one city to the other and be necessarily successful. And I would argue that's the same case from one high school to another in the same context. And so I think the power of some of what's happened is actually giving schools the right data, whether it be the 5 essentials, you know, school climate survey data, or whether it be Freshmen on Track, and then empowering them, equipping them to understand it, because there is an interpretation piece that I think it's helpful to have experts say, this is how you understand what's in front of you. But I think the power of this is that practitioners and school leaders know how to solve these problems. And I think it would be a mistake to say, we are going to tell you that this is the right solution to help your students do better in the freshman year. What we found is that a lot of high schools are doing this in different ways and that it's been successful in their context. Now, to your point about promising practices, it is important, I think, to create the time and the space for school leadership teams and school leaders to share with one another what they're doing, because they are the ones who have the solutions. So the Network for College Success does this really well, where they'll identify a high school that has promising practices around, you know, a specific targeted intervention, and then other leadership teams come and listen to them talk about what they're doing. So localized is good, but we also want to equip them to work together. And you know, one of the things that I've often said is that the most scarce resource in public schooling is time.
Yeah.
It's not money. And giving practitioners and leaders time to actually collaborate and meet together and work on these things is a really critical dimension, I think, of the success in Chicago.
I think I'd like to switch slightly to challenges. I feel like we're describing, I mean, we all love this work. We've all been at it a long time, and I think there's some really special stuff happening in Chicago, but there's a lot of challenges still on the ground and ahead. So if the panel could talk a little bit about that, sort of what you're seeing in your school is sort of the next challenge. What's next? What are the things we need to keep leaning in on and working through?
Yeah, I think as a principal, one of the biggest challenges that I see filling teacher positions. I think that has been the biggest struggle, especially in specialized areas, right? So like, for example, when we look for special education teachers, or adding the other one, right? So adding the bilingual special education teachers, right? So there are very, very few in the district. And I think in the past, one of the problems that we faced was that the budget had been rolling out so late that by the time the budget came out, a lot of the teachers had already gone to the outside districts, right? So the suburban districts. One of the things that I'm very excited about this year is that the budget is rolling out a lot sooner than it had in the past. And it's also provided us the opportunity to be able to post some of those positions early on, where I know that I'm anticipating, for example, a special ed position, and I can already post it and start interviewing without even having the position available yet.
I think one of the things that I would point to, and this is building on Janice's point from the earlier conversation that you had, certainly achievement gaps around African American students, but also gender gap, and this is something we see nationally, that our boys are not doing well, and so there's research needed to really understand that, and also interventions needed for our boys. I know we see this in our own high school. And it's really, really a difficult problem that I think isn't being talked about enough. I think the other thing for the district is we've seen immense amount of progress of propelling students into college. Now we need to help find ways to keep them there. And so that's, you know, another area. And I think from a research perspective, what that means for us is digging more into the higher education space, because I don't think that there's much known about both that transition into college Is that equivalent to the transition from 8th grade into 9th grade? We know that 9th grade year is critical, and the reason is because it's this huge transition for young people. Is that the same thing in the college space? We also, I think, don't have a deep understanding of the role that, in our case, the city colleges or the community colleges play in that. We're really excited about developments in that partnership with the new chancellor, Juan Salgado, and in partnership with CPS, really understanding students' pathways in and out and through the 2-year space. That's just a real missing piece for us. But a lot of our students from Chicago Public Schools either go to city colleges first or they come back to city colleges after going to 4-year, and understanding what those pathways and trajectories look like. So is it that for some groups of students, we can learn that going to city colleges to a 2-year option is better, and can we actually advise on that? Are there ways in which, for particular subgroups of students, we want to advise them to go to 2-year to transfer to 4-year? And I just don't think we really understand that space well. And what does persistence mean? How do we define that? How do we define persistence in the 4-year space? What does that mean in the 2-year space? So I think if we're going to take this next step, we want to put more of our students there, but we also want to keep them there and advise them well about which pathway they take. And I think we still have a lot to learn.
Yeah. I would agree with everything that's been said. Inequity is a common theme, even at the talent level. We have started to put some initiatives in place, like our Teach 2025, which seeks to not only hire a more diverse set of teachers for our district, which I know is a national issue that many people are trying to tackle, but also making sure that we are staffing some of these hard to fill positions in our district. And what one of the first initiatives out of that campaign has been to work with 40 of our hard to staff schools. And these are schools that are more likely to have classrooms where the students don't have a teacher in front of them on the first day. And last year we piloted that program with a small cohort of schools, and I mean, the results have been phenomenal. The retention rate of the teachers who basically came to CPS, many of them new to the district or new to teaching, and they didn't have a preference on which school they wanted to work in. They just wanted to work in a certain type of school and serve in that way. And we've just seen, I believe the retention rate is much higher than it has been for teachers who just kind of come in cold and interview and pick a school. So I think that that's a huge issue. I also think that some of the enrollment trends are some things that keep me up at night, or things I wonder about. Chicago's landscape is ever changing, Illinois in general. And so because we're a large choice-based system, that creates its own set of opportunities and challenges, especially if you're a school that is not, a school that's highly sought after. But then that, coupled with the out-migration in particular of African-American families in the district, is something that we worry about. And so my role in that is making sure that the school systems, in particular the neighborhood schools, are strong so that they serve as an anchor to keep people not only in the city but in the state. So I would count that as probably the biggest challenge. I think we have some of the best schools in the state, and we talked about our performance earlier, but it's really an approach that seeks to support the entire city, because when you see that type of transition, it's something that we have to definitely address. So the universal enrollment process that we just put in place, Go CPS, in my opinion, is one of the things that we're trying to use as a lever to make parents aware of all the options they have in the city, and really use that as an anchor to keep families connected to Chicago.
And as a parent, I thank you for making that process more simple.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Before we open it up to questions, which we want to make sure we have time for, again, on the what could be replicated, or what, if you had to pick, one or two things, sort of a speed round of, what is the thing that could be replicated? What is the advice to policymakers wanting to replicate this type of success?
You can.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, you should go first.
Well, I think that, a couple of things come to mind. It might seem surprising, but this idea of linking K-12 kids with their higher education results is something that had never really been done systematically before it was done in Chicago. And I think that is an incredibly important thing that can go from here to other contexts.
Yeah.
It's a really complex process. It involves a close partnership with CPS around the data, the student clearinghouse data that's used to make that match. But to Janice's point about autonomy with accountability, I think it gave our system and high schools an entirely different viewpoint on what their goal in, educating students is.
Yeah.
So for a long time, and if you think back, and we've all been around, for a long time, this is my 24th year at UEI and at the precursor organizations. And really the focus was high school graduation forever. We were just going to be excited if kids, got to high school graduation. And I think making this link and showing high schools and showing the school district and showing ourselves as citizens where our students end up, helps people to really look towards the horizon and say, we are responsible for our young people's trajectories after they leave our school, and we should look at the milestones that matter and put the data together in a way that happens. So that's number one. I think the second thing that I would add, and I think there's been threads of this in our conversation, but I just want to emphasize this, is that at the heart of this is a human capital story. And I think the quality of human capital of principal leaders, of teachers, of leadership at the district level, of the kind of leadership and people that are in the nonprofit space, I will tell you that when I came into the education space, it was almost empty. I mean, a lot of the organizations that exist today, the Fund, Advance Illinois, a lot of these organizations didn't exist. And so I think, number one, investing in talent at all levels is really important, and I think it creates a momentum that attracts other talent to come to the city. So those would be the two things I would emphasize.
I think for me, the culture that has been created within CPS, culture of both autonomy and accountability, I think those two play hand in hand very well, because I like the accountability and I like the autonomy that I have as a principal. I like being responsible to something, right? So like, for example, now we have the vision. Before we had the pillars, and now we have the core essentials. Prior to that, I don't remember having had a vision that everybody was aware of. Maybe there was, but I wasn't sure that there was. But now I know what it is, and it has been clearly communicated, not only to me, but to all stakeholders. Parents know it, students know it, and everybody knows it, right? And with that comes the autonomy that I know what I have to do as a principal. And then the big one, and I'm not sure how that could be replicated, but the support systems that we have as principals, right? So I have the support of, for example, the fund, and then reports that are created by the consortium that help me plan for the year. Yeah.
So to build on that, I mean, I think one thing cities can choose to replicate is to pick a perspective from which all of the work kind of centers itself. In Chicago, the work centers around principals. I'm not just saying that because I run the fund and we care about principals. We center the work the consortium does, the work we do, the work lots of nonprofits do across the city is really focused on principals as the key bridge between students and that work that needs to get done. And cities can replicate what we do with principals. They can count them, first of all. I'm amazed. We run a community of practice for cities across the country with the support of Joyce. You know, how few of them could tell me, how many principals did you lose last year? Not roughly. Specifically, how many did you lose and from where? You can start by counting them and saying to yourself, what I really need to do is keep Rodolfo in his job. He's a year 6 principal.
I need you to keep me in my job.
Yes. We know in Chicago they climb the learning curve and they're really hitting their stride in years 5 and 6. We invest in a fellowship in year 6 because we want him to stay and transition the great work that he's done in a smart and thoughtful way when he goes on to run some big thing someday. And so count your principals, center the work around principals or teachers or whatever it is that you pick, and then make sure that whatever policies or organizations are doing work, that you're really paying attention to how it's playing out on the ground. This policy example Janice gave, the work the principals are doing to give feedback to the district around where policy is working and where it isn't is critical, and we miss that so many times. We pass beautiful policy, great legislation, great policy at the district level, and then we never really get to the place where we understand where it's hurting the people on the ground.
I mean, I think everything that I've think has already been said. The only thing that I would add for district leaders in particular is make sure that your school quality policy, whatever that is, really matches your core values. What I see happen oftentimes is people talk about the things that matter to them, but when you look at how they measure school success or how they hold schools accountable, some of those things aren't there because they're too controversial, or, you know, we'll never get the parents or the school board to approve, you know, whatever that challenge may be. And I would just say, you know, when I look to a school system, when I want to know what they value, I look at the school quality policy, and that tells me a lot about the work that they're doing. Yeah.
Thank you. With that, we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. And just as a reminder, if you could please state your name and organization before your question, that would be helpful to us. And there are microphones going to be passed around, or they will show up at you, or
Teacher voices.
Yes.
yeah. Go ahead. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Ryan Benjamin. I work at a charter school here in the district, Washington Global Public Charter. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more specifically about what principal autonomy means, because that can mean a lot of different things. You had talked about budget, but I was wondering about curriculum, staffing, assessment facilities, and some other areas, if you can. Thanks.
So for me, the autonomy comes in where I am able to make the decisions within the building of the things that I need within the building, right? So even the approach to instruction that we have the common core, but the way that we choose in the building to master or show mastery of those standards, it's really up to the principals, right? So like, for example, I'm a workshop school, so I follow more of a Lucy Calkins approach. And then my teachers develop their own units, and I provide all the additional support in the building that the teachers need to be able to show that mastery. So that's the autonomy to me. I don't have to buy a Basil. I don't have to do any of those things. I don't have to get a program and bring it into the school and sell it to the teachers. It's not that way at all. It's actually all the teachers creating everything within the school and making the decisions within the school with my ILT, them walking around and identifying problems of practice and changing instruction that way, where they're fully bought into the things that we do in the school because they're leading the work within the school. So that level of autonomy comes down from Dr. Jackson to me, and then me to the teachers.
I would add too, the budget autonomy is really important. I remember working in a district prior to student-based budgeting, and pretty much with the exception of discretionary funds, the district would tell you this is the number of teachers you need to hire, the number of counselors, and whatever else you needed to support the school. And now principals have much more autonomy in that regard. Also, I think the curriculum piece needs to be underscored, because what I hear from a lot of principals is that is one of the things that makes them feel more empowered to actually meet some of the accountability metrics that we've put out there. So I would say that. And then again, just I think this notion of influencing district policy is pretty powerful, and I have not seen that in large school systems where, without complaining or maybe writing letters or getting your parents to come to the board meeting and say something. I don't know of many districts where there is a systematic way for principals to get together and look at things that influence their day-to-day practice and make recommendations and actually see those recommendations change as a result.
I would just add too, you framed your question about the autonomies that principals have, but underscoring this idea that the local schools are also choosing their principal is a really important piece of this, and also the autonomy to choose your own teachers, which does not happen in some school districts where that's all handled centrally. So I think those things are really unique.
Yes, there's someone standing up right there.
Hi, my name is Russell Armstrong with CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, and obviously CPS is a big partner of ours. And so the theme of this event is Unpacking Gains, and I was hoping that you could speak to a little bit the social emotional framework and how most people think of it as just for students, but what have you seen in terms of assisting the adults in the room, both teachers and school leaders, in terms of modeling that framework and what impact it's had?
We're actually going to be hosting the CASEL convening in a couple of weeks. So Chicago Public Schools has prioritized social emotional learning, and in all the ways that we talked about some of the other things. First, changing policy, so reducing the number, changing the policy around suspending students and really taking a strong a strong line against excluding students from schools. And I remember I was a principal at the time when some of those changes took place and being a bit skeptical, right? Because if you can't tell, accountability is something that's important to me. But what we ended up seeing is that it wasn't working. And when we stopped excluding students from school and record rates, attendance went up, which again, the consortium tells us attendance is directly correlated to student performance. Graduation rates are going up. So I think that we have organized our school system in a way where people know it's a priority. If you look at the school quality rating policy and the reports that parents get to see, each school has the opportunity to earn a safe school certification. So we make public and transparent whether or not the children, parents, and teachers in this school identify this as a safe environment. And we look at things like the suspension rate, the type of supports that are in place for students. There's a survey, again, that comes from the consortium. And so what we found in that is not every school that was level 1 plus earn the safe school certification. And so it really changed the conversation, because if a certain demographic group or students didn't feel safe in your school, principals had to work through that. As far as adults, that's new work that we're doing. Last year on Valentine's Day, we put out social emotional supports for our teachers on Love Day. We thought that was cute. But we still have a long way to go, because our teachers are doing very difficult work, and a lot of them need additional social and emotional support in order to come in and do a great job every day, because they're working with our students that have, in many cases been exposed to trauma, in some cases multiple forms of trauma.
There's someone all the way in the back. And to underscore, I would encourage people to go to Chicago Public Schools website. You can see the school by school sort of reports, what parents see, what it includes. But all of those factors, how well arts is integrated into the school, safety, all the metrics on student outcomes. I mean, it's the level of transparency, I think, is also one of the critical drivers of success here.
Yep.
And then there's someone all the way in the back too after.
Good morning. I'm Arnold Fagey, and I'm Executive Director of Public Advocacy for Kids. A Chicago high school graduate from Finger.
Oh, yeah.
Proud of my city. A White Sox fan. And the work that I do is the kind of work that you're doing. It's almost a dream team listening to you talking about the advances that Chicago has made. And when you bring Valerie Strauss and David Brooks together, you know that you should get a raise in pay. I'd like to, the one thing we haven't talked about is parents. And the parents are in the south side of Chicago, Bronzeville, we're talking about the National Academy. It sounds as though that noise around the south side and the neighborhood organizing, the school closing, the contention with ROM, all of that seems to have died down. Where are parents? Excuse me, maybe it didn't. Maybe it's more of a dream on my part, but talk to me about how you're working out sort of these issues that have lingered for a long time and throughout all of the changes at the central level.
Yeah, I think you said that jokingly, but there's always going to be, Chicago, we are implementing change, and some of those changes are hard for people. The pace in some cases is fast for people, and they have trouble with change in general. But one of the things that I think I have brought to this is really this community by community approach. And part of what you're hearing, in particular with the issue near Bronzeville or the near South region, is we just have a few things kind of happening at the same time. So we talked about enrollment in our district, but there are also parts of the city like that area that are growing rapidly and gentrifying, and a lot of urban districts deal with issues like that. And it really is about making smarter decisions and moving away from some of the past practices. So in the past, I would say that you know, if you had a high income area that needed a new school, you would just build them a new school. But if you know anything about Chicago, we have a lot of communities that are, you know, right next to one another, and there's a building that is underutilized, but people don't want to cross a boulevard or address the race and socioeconomic differences. And we have taken that on, and we know that it's not going to be easy, but as a district in a city, we can't afford to build a new school or keep these, you know, enclaves in place just so that people feel comfortable. We have a lot of land that needs to be used, and so it's just a different approach. With that said, each community is unique. What I've learned is that there are some communities, we actually had 2 projects. Another one was Ogden Jenner, which real quick took the most affluent, the highest income zip code in Chicago, paired right with Cabrini Green, which many of you may recall. But the community really bought into that, and they work together, and it's going along a lot smoothly than some of the other ones, but it really is about starting that conversation. And again, the answer can't always be new construction to keep people separate. One thing that I would like to see is more integration, especially where it makes sense, and we know that that's not easy, especially when you bring race and SES differences into the fold.
Unfortunately, I'm getting the sign to wrap us up. I don't know if the panelists have any final thoughts before we close.
I feel like that went fast.
I know, it went too fast. We could be here all day. We don't get this opportunity enough to tell the good story. Any final thoughts?
I think I said everything.
Okay, we're good. I just want to thank everyone, all the panelists, for sharing your insights. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us today. And thank you to our partners, Center for American Progress and Education Trust, for hosting and giving me the opportunity to moderate. It's been fun. And we look forward to having you follow the success, the continued success. And Janice will be here, we hope, for a very long time. So thank you very much.
Is this on? Okay. I'm Catherine Brown. I'm the Vice President for Education Policy here at the Center for American Progress. And before we close, we are fortunate to hear from another leader who has spent decades serving the people of Chicago, Congressman Danny Davis, who represents Illinois' 7th Congressional District, and is here with us today to deliver some closing remarks. And Congressman Davis has championed understanding and addressing the educational crisis of African American students, and particularly the crisis facing African American men. As the chair of the Education and Labor Task Force of the Congressional Black Caucus, he helps lead the caucus's work to promote equal opportunity in education, especially for students who have been traditionally underserved. And he has led the charge to examine racial disparities in discipline facing Black students and students with disabilities. He has pushed for more data to allow for greater understanding of the racial disparities, particularly in preschool expulsions, in line with the great work that goes on around Chicago. He has pressed for improving teacher diversity and supporting the education of foster youth, homeless youth, youth involved in juvenile justice, and correctional education. He also helped President Obama establish a White House initiative to improve educational opportunities for African American students. And as the ranking member of the Subcommittee for Human Resources within the Committee on Ways and Means, he leads the effort to ensure quality educational opportunities within the federal programs of temporary assistance for needy families and the unemployment insurance program. And so we are very excited to have him here to help celebrate the tremendous progress that Chicago School District is making. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Davis.
Thank you very much. And the one thing that you left out is that I've also had the good fortune and the great pleasure to work with some of the top educators, especially public school educators in America, one of whom is here now, and it's a pleasure to see you. As a matter of fact, in the very same community where Dr. Jackson was principal before becoming the chief education officer, that is the community where I've lived, worked, and been a part of ever since I've lived in the city of Chicago. It is indeed a pleasure to be here with all of you. And fresh off the press, I just picked up a piece of information that says How effective is your school district? A new measure shows where students learn the most in the New York Times. And it says that the Chicago public school system, grades 3 to 8, are just doing enormous advancement. That they're just great. So I thought it would just be nice to have this in my hands to hold up. There's nothing like having pride. And there's also sometimes when I think of evaluation, I think of the gentleman who was inquired of a reporter about African Americans in particular, and she asked Dr. DuBois, supposedly, said, why is it and when is it that African Americans are going to reach the mainstream of American society? Supposedly, she said, I go to your meetings all the time, and you're just whining and crying and trying to figure out when will you get there. And supposedly he said to her, young lady, let me tell you, a people so deprived ought not to be expected to race with the wind. And what he was essentially saying is, if you look at the depths from which you have come, as opposed to only the heights to which you have achieved, then you may have a different. So when I was asked to say something about the success of the Chicago public schools and what they're doing, first thing I thought was that, hey, I'm probably not the best person to do that. As a matter of fact, I know that I'm not the best person to do that. But I must confess that I believe that education, especially public education as we have known it, has been the greatest equalizer that this country has experienced. And without it, America would be a very different place. We wouldn't be nearly the country that we are. So I take great delight and great pleasure in looking back sometimes as we go forward, looking back to where we may have come from. I can make some comments because many people see success like they see beauty. They take the position that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. They also take the position that success depends upon what you're looking for, what you're looking at, and how much you understand about what it is. A lot of folks have said a lot of things about education. But when I look back over the past 10 years, I'll just say in Chicago, the conversation has oftentimes been about state budgets, how much money is available, whether there is enough, can we meet the pension payments, can we meet the obligations that we are bound to have, what are the boundaries, where do kids go to school, which kids go here and which ones go there. Dr. Jackson just mentioned some of that. I don't want my kids to go to school in this neighborhood, even though it may be across the street. And so we've had great big fights about all of that. But I don't think we've spent as much time on making sure that our children have access to the technological advances that are taking place. And they are many. I had the good fortune this past Saturday to open the robotics competition at the University of Illinois. And I've done that now for the last 4 or 5 years because one of my staff persons put together our own team. and that's his hobby. But I can tell you some of the things that young people are doing and the advances in technology reinforce that we need to put as much resource. Plus, I just returned from Geneva, Switzerland last week, where we spent the week looking at some of the technological things that are taking place in that country. And you're really mystified when you see what is taking place and you recognize how great the need is. I am concerned that we may not be putting as much emphasis on teaching fundamentals of reading, writing, and arithmetic, even though we see advances. I still come into contact with large numbers of young people who can barely read, especially African American boys. And I'm always pleased when I'm associated with doing anything to help advance this population group and put it more into the mainstream of intellectualization. As a matter of fact, I have a little book, and I've been planning to give you that book. My staffer knows that Willie Lee, it's a book that a lady wrote who went to Beasley. She lives in D.C. now. But the book is so profound until I almost remember verbatim how she begins it. She starts by saying, I'm a teacher, and I just love teaching, really I do, because it gives me a chance to tell our children about the struggles that we've been through. Then she says that this story is about a little boy named Willie Lee. He was a smart little boy, as smart as he could be. And the only two things he wanted out of life was to learn to read, and the other was to be free. Well, obviously, the story was written about a period called slavery in our history, but I think it has such a great message for boys, especially little African American boys. So I just wish that every reading teacher had one of them. And so I give them out every chance I get. I just buy them and give them away like the guy used to give away warm fuzzies because I think they make a lot of good sense. But I'm also concerned that we may not be putting enough emphasis on teaching children how we make decisions in our country and the importance of public participation and involvement as a part of citizenship. Every time there's an election, that's reinforced for me because there are millions of people who don't vote, millions and millions. We just had one. Turnout in some places 25, 26, 30%, which means if you had 100 people, 70 of them didn't feel the need to help make those public decisions. And so even though curriculums are tight and time is tight, I think we've got to put a little more emphasis in that direction so that people will know more about the roles that they play in making the kind of decisions that we need. The other thing is, and the thing that I'm really proud of in terms of the Chicago public school system, is the fact that there is a recognition. We just had a hearing in Ways and Means yesterday, and every time we have hearings we're talking about, we're getting ready for something called TANF. And people are talking about how many technical jobs there are available, and people don't have the skill sets to fill those. Every time I talk to a business group, and especially the manufacturing associations, they say, yep, there are lots of jobs, but there are skill gaps. and we can't find people to fill the positions. Something is emerging in Chicago and in the Chicago public school systems where the Chicago public schools are open to a vast array of partnerships. And one of the partnerships is with something called the Manufacturing Renaissance Partnership. And that's a partnership that is seeking to develop skill programs, manufacturing programs. And there are 3 or 4 schools that have already started. There are 180 young people in the MC programs at the ACCA school, at Bowen, at Prosser. 2 of those schools are actually in the area where I live. And there are efforts to increase and to actually have young people understand the value of manufacturing, but also to prepare young people so that the Manufacturing Association can't say, we are looking for individuals to fill these jobs, especially when we have the very high levels of unemployment in places where individuals can't figure out where to work. And so while I wouldn't say that there has been absolute magic, I would say that the Chicago public school system has fulfilled all of the requirements that we'd like to see a public institute make. But we can say that they're on the right track. And when you consider all of the socio-economic issues that a city like Chicago brings, much of Chicago was the port of entry for many of the last group of rural African Americans who migrated from the South with very little preparation and education in a formal way. And so you can't tell me that that is the same as another kind of environment where individuals have had a different set of circumstances. And those are some things that I know a little bit about. I actually went to a one-room school when I was a kid growing up. Never went to school more than 5 months a year. I lived in the rural South, an agrarian community, where one teacher, Miss Beattie King, taught 8 grades, plus the little primer and the big primer by itself. And so the other component of education, I think, is parenting. The parents didn't know a great deal about formalized education and training, but they knew a great deal about the hope that they had for their children. One of the best feelings I ever had as a child was being in the 6th grade and not having a speech for graduation. You graduated at 6th grade and at 12th grade. And I didn't have a speech. So I told my mother, I says, you know what? You all really don't have to worry about getting me anything new for school closing and all of that. And she says, why not? I said, well, first of all, I don't have a speech. Secondly, you probably don't have much money anyway, so it's no big deal. She said, well, why don't you have a speech? I said, I don't know. Miss Smith didn't give me one. She said, well, I'll be up there tomorrow to ask Miss Smith. We lived about 6 or 7 miles from the school. And I guess about 11 o'clock that morning, in walked my mother, that we always felt was the best looking woman in the world in the first place, that she was just a gorgeous woman. But when she walked in that door to talk to Mrs. Smith about my concern I was on top of the world. Absolutely on top of the world. So we've got to get as much parental engagement, involvement every day whenever they can, teaching at home, teaching at night, so that they too will know that they play a role, a serious role in the education of our children. Thank you all so much for the panel, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.